and you guys can go.
Awesome. All right. So thank you so much, Jordana, for that introduction. I'm super excited to be here. And like Jordana was saying, just as a quick recap, hi, everyone. My name is Takeru Nagayoshi, and I also go by TK. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a English and research teacher in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and also the 2020 Massachusetts Teacher of the Year. Since we are here talking about the model minority myth, leaning in on our identities, right? I wanted to say that I identify as an Asian man, a Japanese American Asian man, and also a gay man.
Thank you, TK. My name is Kiona, Dr. Kiona, if you want to put respect on my name. If you're an adult, I tell you I'm a professor in statistics. If you are a Gen Z or millennial, which are adults but children also, I am an Instagram influencer, which is sometimes annoying to think about, but I am. But TK and I came together, and because this is Black History Month, I also just want to point out that we did do a Asian and Black solidarity movements discussion with the Smithsonian Institute, which is what this was based off of. So I'm going to drop it in the chat for y'all to peruse if you would like, but we are not talking about Asian and Black solidarity movements today. We're talking about model minority myth, which is the opposite of solidarity movements. So just to preface that, and that I do go by she, her pronouns. And I always tell my students, I hate looking like an alien when you guys all look at us. We want it to be completely interactive. So we are going to be interacting in the chat all the time, asking you questions. Like, this is a learning experience for both of us. So please don't feel afraid to interact with us when we ask you questions.
And we just wanted to thank Bellevue College. Thank you to the organizers, Jordana. This session that we have was based off of the Smithsonian webinar series, We Are Not a Stereotype. Dr. Kiona was talking a little bit about that, and specifically was a session about the model minority myth. And we had a collaboration with Liz Kleinrock, also a wonderful educator. And so we just wanted to shout out and send her some love. And as far as today's content is concerned, we wanted to revise the topic a little bit around more recent developments that have been happening. We also want to acknowledge that even at our own school campuses, there may have been racial tensions, especially around what it means to be a person of color, but with different experiences, right? And work in solidarity with one another. And as Dr. Kiona was saying, we want to make it as interactive as possible. So feel free to send us a message, ask us questions, and try to engage us as we give this lecture series. Right. So that being said, why don't we get started? And I'm going to show a slide for us to kind of react to. So Dr. Kiona and I looked at a couple of images, took some screenshots, and they all highlight some uncomfortable things that have been taking place. And so if we can just take about maybe a minute and a half to look through some of these screenshots. And if you can let us know in the chat, you can send it as a general chat or a private chat, one word or reaction that you have to that. That'd be great. So let's take about, again, another minute and a half or so. Let us know in the chat, what word do you have in response to some of these screenshots that you see?
Yeah, how are you feeling? How does it make you feel? All those things, let us know in the chat. Don't be shy. Also, I think you have to reply, yeah, hurt, divided, angry. Hate.
Kiona, as those words are coming in, what are some reactions that you have to some of these screenshots?
I'm tired, and I'm also bored with these excuses, and also this rhetoric. That's kind of how I feel right now. It also makes me sad. What about you?
The same. I'm kind of, I know that recently there have been a lot of spikes against Asian elderly people. My parents are in their 60s, and so I do worry about them as well. And yeah, I'm noticing a lot of that sort of disappointment, that unease, right? That anger and negative feelings coming around. Yeah, I think in the United States, right, when we talk about race and any sort of racial dialogue, they tend to exist along this black and white binary. which oftentimes excludes Asian people to actually join the conversation. And as an Asian person, I know that that can feel and create a sense of disconnect. And I know that for other people, specifically other people of color, that can also breed a lot of ignorance about Asian people. And I feel like these different slides certainly capture that kind of disconnect.
Yeah. These posts also reflect the unique challenges Asian people face. We face discrimination and discriminatory attitudes, but we're simultaneously perceived by many as privileged, right? This idea at the core of the model minority myth is that Asians are more privileged. And Asian people are put on a pedestal for being exemplary minorities, but as minorities, we still lack privileges afforded to the dominant group and lack privileges that a lot of people think that are afforded to us. So this is what we're going to dive into today.
Yeah. And so let's start off by just making sure that we understand the definition of what the model minority is. Uh, Long story short, it's a term that romanticizes Asian people, specifically Asians in the United States. And it's this idea that Asians, right, are perceived as enjoying socioeconomic success, especially in comparison to other minority groups. And it's a relatively new term. It was coined by a sociologist by the name of William Peterson in 1996, who argued, you can see the article over here, in his infamous New York Times piece, Success Story of the Japanese American Style. And he argued basically that Japanese Americans were well suited to overcome adversity because they had good citizenship cultural values. And there was a lot of this emphasis, whoops, sorry about that. A lot of this emphasis on education, hard work, this reverence for family and community, respect for authority and law-abiding nature. And it was an idea that was so culturally popular that over time, it has been applied not just to Japanese Americans, but Asians and Asian Americans as a whole.
So hearing model minority, what are some stereotypes associated with model minority that you've heard growing up? Go ahead and drop those in the chat. And also, whenever you drop your ideas of what those stereotypes are, let me know where you heard them from. Did you hear them from your parents, the media, somebody telling it to you, all those things?
As folks are letting us know examples of model minority stereotypes that they've heard or they've encountered, Kiana, I'm curious, have you heard of any, or do you, is any particularly resonating with you at the moment?
Yeah, my favorite. Asians are white. Asians are rich. Those are my two faves.
Like, so to give a little context, I was born and raised in the States, but then I moved to Japan. And then in middle school, I came back to the States. And I was so surprised at how all of a sudden people started seeing me and treating me as smart. I failed math in Japan, but then when I moved to the States, I was put into an accelerated math program. And it was the first time I started realizing that how I'm being treated is along those stereotypes of Asians being smart, well-behaved, and doing well in school. And as an educator, it's a concept that I definitely see play out as well.
Yeah, you hit that. Asians are good at math. I mean, I did get my master's in statistics, so maybe I played into that, but
I'm seeing a lot of like the diligence tropes. All Asians play musical instruments. I bet violin is coming to mind, not drums.
yeah. My mom actually took away my cello. She said I sounded like a dying cow. So there's a crushed model minority right there.
I'm also an English teacher, full disclosure, not a math teacher either. Um, have y'all ever heard of like Asians being passive or quiet? That's like another um, stereotype that I oftentimes hear.
Asians
Submissive.
are submissive. That's a good one. Another one that I hear a lot and that I hate is that Asians don't care about social justice. Asians are silent.
Yeah. Do you think, what do you think the stereotype and idea that folks tap into when they talk about that are?
I think people get it from the media. I think they watch videos and they think that Asians are what is represented on TV. And I think they don't see any Asians in school, at least like school figures in their curriculum. They don't know really anything about Asian history. So all of these ideas perpetrate through like television shows and not actual curriculum.
Yeah. Let us know where you have first encountered some of these stereotypes that Kiana and I have been talking about and that you also see in the chat. I also agree, Asians are absent in the US curricula. Either we were these like ancient philosophers or wartime aggressors or victims of the yellow peril. And we were rarely celebrated in the diversity that we exist in this country today. And I grew up in sort of a media ecosystem where oftentimes when I did see Asian people, right, we were martial artists, we were delivery folks, and rarely ever the lead.
Or terrorists sometimes.
Oh.
Yeah. So before I move on, I wanted to clarify what we mean by Asian and who is Asian American. The term Asian American includes all people with origins in the Far East, Southeast Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. This is according to the US Census, okay? So not my personal definition, but just a definition of what Asian American and what is counted as an Asian American, and I circled in the yellow. But does anybody know what East Asia is? Can you name any ethnicities from East Asia? And if any of you are East Asian, go ahead and drop in the chat. And if you're not, go ahead and drop in the chat too. We'd love to see where you're from and what ethnicities you are. Korea. I'm half Korean, so I would be East Asian. TK is East Asian. He's Japanese. It also includes China, yes. Vietnam is Southeast Asia. But yeah, so Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan, Mongolia are all East Asian countries. And when we think about model minority, usually it targets East Asian people. So Asian people cover a huge landmass and many different cultures, shades of skin, languages, religions. There's lots of different things about Asian people. So when we say Asians are not a monolith, it's because the Asians are such a diverse group of people. And so when we're talking about model minority myth, it's usually applied to specifically East Asia, but can apply to those who pass as East Asian as well.
Thanks for that. And I love those chat conversations I've been kind of reading through, and I wish I could respond to all of them. But why don't we get into kind of the meat of, well, what's the problem with having these model minority myths to begin with, right? So the first issue that I really wanted to highlight was that the model minority myth at the end of the day is just not true. It's historically inaccurate. It's a gross overgeneralization. It's factually wrong. Just by looking at this map of Asia, we know that there are so many different countries with very different histories, right? And so what we're going to do in this next section is try to break down these understandings, these misunderstandings of what it means to be Asian. And we're first going to begin by deconstructing the myth that East Asians have a proximity to whiteness, because this is an idea that some people use to say East Asians are not people of color, Asians aren't people of color, and therefore are model minorities, so to speak. But when you really take a step back and look at the history of East Asian Americans in the US, we see a lot of evidence to the contrary.
Right, exactly. So let's go ahead and take a look at some US court cases to get an idea of this concept. So maybe a lot of you have heard of the Chinese Exclusion Acts. That was the first one. So the first immigration law in the United States that excluded people based on race or ethnicity was the Chinese Exclusion Acts. It targeted specifically Chinese workers. Then what's not so commonly known is it was followed by the Geary Act, which extended the Chinese Exclusion Act and then required Chinese residents to carry special documentation. And if you were caught without that certificate, you're sentenced to hard labor or deportation. Bail was only an option if the accused were vouched for by a credible white witness. So now you can see that the unequal power happening between whites and Asians already. It was present even in the earliest days of Asian people in the United States, that Asian people were below white people. Next were the alien land laws of 1913 and 1920, which forbade those who were not American citizens and were not eligible for citizenship from owning agriculture. So if you can't become a citizen, then you can't own land. And the two people who were allowed to become citizens were white people and Black people. That left out Asians and Native Americans. So this law was specifically targeted towards Asian and Native Americans. The law did not affect white people and Black people, and it would not be repealed until the 1960s. Then we're going to move on to court cases, such as the Supreme Court case of People versus Hall, which ruled that Chinese people, like Black people and Indigenous Americans, were not allowed to testify in court, making it impossible for Chinese immigrants to seek justice through legal pathways. So the testimony of a Chinese man in a murder case was thrown out because the Chinese were deemed, quote, a race of people whom nature has marked as inferior and who are incapable of progress or intellectual development beyond a certain point. The judge goes on, but I'll stop there. Then, so now we have not able to own land, not able to vote, not able to have citizenship, not able to migrate, right? And then now we're moving on to education. So in 1927, the school of segregation case Lum versus Rice in Mississippi denied a 9-year-old Martha Lum the right to attend the local white school. This was again repeated in Plessy versus Ferguson, where the judge contrasted Chinese people with Black people, stating that the Chinese race is a race so different from our own that we do not permit those belonging to it to become citizens of the United States. So they were excluded from education as well. Knowing these things, can we agree that Asian people have historically been oppressed in the United States and were never considered part of the white privileged class? If you disagree, go ahead and drop it in the chat. If we're on the same page of understanding, let us know too. Just be like, holla, got you, whatever. Yes, I understand. That would be great.
Kiona, something I do with my students is if you agree with us or if anything that we say resonates with you at some point, or if anything someone else says resonates with you at one point, drop a +1 in the chat so that we know that you agree or are resonating and vibing with us. But I'm going to take it back to a quote that Kiona said, and she was saying, Asians are a diverse group of people. We're not a monolith, right? And that's because of the vast differences that exist across the continent, right? And each country has a very different relationship with the United States. And naturally, this is also reflected in our immigration patterns. And so Kiona's going to talk about that too.
Right, so this isn't only reflected in racist laws that we just learned about, it's also in the ways that Asian people have immigrated to the United States. And I believe personally, this is what people get tripped up on the most. So there are 3 different ways Asian Americans came to the United States. One were as laborers hundreds of years ago whose descendants still live in the USA today. There's those people who founded all the Chinatowns across America. There's 2 by servitude, war, adoption, human trafficking, and undocumented methods due to US imperialism of Asia. A lot of people know that as the Vietnamese War, the Korean War, but there are so many instances of imperialism that is just not taught in our education, and I won't be covering here, but there are ways that Asians came escaping imperialism of their own countries. And then third, as professionals, when Asians were finally allowed to legally migrate, the visa type only allowed those with certain backgrounds to enter the United States. That includes today. The US specifically recruited professionals and scientists, resulting in an influx of already educated Asians who make up part of the Asian American community today.
So even in those 3 examples that Kiona gave us, there's so many different categories of the Asian diaspora, right? Which goes to show the complexity of the Asian immigration history. And even though the model minority myth does acknowledge the Asian professionals who arrived and became successful, it's problematic by and large because it ignores, it erases a greater majority of Asians who came to the States, often through servitude, war, adoption, human trafficking, and many other undocumented methods. And so in the next set of slides, Dr. Kiona is going to further disaggregate some of this data and show us a little bit of the statistics and information to dispel this idea that Asians are living this model minority existence.
Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the statistics. Now, when we throw all Asians together, what does it look like? Despite having such different migration patterns, different countries, different religions, languages, etc., ultimately, we are only 5% of the population. And that population is concentrated in specific spaces. So if you look at the map, they're in California, New York. I personally live in Texas. So there we have a little spot there in Texas, but we are not represented nationally. Okay, and people don't really understand that. And the historical context among Asian data is incredibly important to take into account, as our differences start long before we actually arrive in the United States. So treating us statistically as a monolith means drowning out important patterns in data. So if we see it in action, a common trope I hear is all Asians are rich, a privileged financial class, right? And you're talking to a Korean person who, qualified for food stamps most of my life. And I hear this all the time. And I commonly see this targeted specifically at East Asians, right? Crazy rich Asians. But when you look at the data, it's true, right? We see that the median Asian income is much higher than even white people. Like, wow, Asians really are crazy rich. But actually, this is not the whole story. So if you think about a median income of a household, how many people are in that household? This is ignoring that Asians are the most likely to have 3 or more working individuals per household than any other group because they're not making enough to survive. Second of all, Asians, like I said, are populated on the East Coast and West Coast, which are metropolitan cities where cost of living is higher. So this is not only what Asians are making, this is what Asians are having to spend to live every day. And then when accounting for time in school and hours worked, Asians fail to reach that of white Americans, meaning that Asians have to get more education and work more hours even to attain similar salaries as white people. So this is a totally different story than what this is telling us. If we go to the next slide, we break it down even further. It does not, you'll see here that it's actually the Indian American that has the highest. I don't know if you can really see that well, but this top salary is the Indian American, and they have the highest household income, and they are also Asian. East Asians fail to even meet the average of the Asian American household income. So the 3 yellow arrows on the right are the East Asian lines, and this red line here is the average Asian income, and they don't meet that. Okay, and then if you look at Koreans, the bottom arrow, who migrated after the Korean War but did not get refugee status, barely even meet the US median household income. So if you see like the black line here on the left-hand side, Koreans are barely making it over the median household income in the United States. So you see that, East Asians aren't the top. And then even more important are the Southeast Asians on even below the poverty line. And many of them are on government assistance. Lots of them came over as refugees and war survivors. You see that these stats don't take into account historical context, barriers to access. It's incredibly harmful. The difference between Asians migrating with education and class privilege that was already attained in Asia and those who have come to the United States as refugees, wartime survivors, human trafficked, etc., that's not being shown when we lump all Asians together. Also, the referencing that Asians are almost white, where East Asians and their light skin privilege, well, that's just a myth. If you look here, our light skin privilege doesn't turn into financial gain. It's just not supported by the data here. And there's no evidence that skin color and income have any correlation. So this shows the Asian identity as one of the most heterogeneous groups and points out the fallacy in how we conceptualize the Asian and what picture we perceive the Asian person to be. And this can be applied across all principles: education, health, and employment. And by lumping all Asians together, we end up erasing Asian oppression and erasing truth.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Kiona. She did a wonderful job letting us know all the ways in which that myth is not true from a historical perspective, from a statistical perspective, how it erases a lot of different Asian identities. And so moving beyond dispelling the myth, though, let's take a moment to think about, well, what are the consequences of therefore believing it, right? And I want us to think about, if we look at how and when the myth is evoked, we actually see that oftentimes it's being used as a racial wedge politics. Something that creates division amongst communities of color and perpetuates anti-blackness. And so that is the section that I'm going to be focusing on in the next couple of slides. So in the slide that you're going to see on your end, you're going to see a couple of terms show up. And these are some terms that are commonly ascribed to the model minority versus the problem minority, as according to, and that was the language that Peterson said in his own language. And as these words are sort of populating on your screen right now, think about how in many ways, whoops, that wasn't supposed to happen, my bad. how in many ways the same kind of stereotypes that are used against Asian people are sometimes in direct opposition to the same sort of stereotypes that are used against Black communities of color, often to target them, right? And so we see how the model minority trope is problematic because it implies that racial discrimination, right, on one hand, can be overcome with gumption. It was that idea that Peterson had in his article. If Asians can be successful, why can other minority groups, why can't Black people also do it? But also at the same time, it's ignoring many of the systemic, institutional, the ideological power structures that beget and maintain these inequities amongst racial groups and ethnic groups to begin with, right? And what that does is that at best, it suggests that these racial and ethnic groups that are experiencing hardship are lacking in some kind of genetic or cultural trait that's requisite for success. And at worst, it's serving as a racial wedge politics that justify things like white supremacy, that divide solidarity among people of color, and also, as you can see from this table, perpetuates anti-blackness. So I use that term, racial wedge, a couple of times. And so let me try to ground it a bit in theory. What do I mean by a racial wedge? So it's an idea that was first explored in the theory of racial triangulation coined by Claire Jean Kim. And she argues that the Asian model minority narrative is something, a tool that is essentially exploited to maintain white dominance, white supremacy in our country. So according to Kim, Asian Americans essentially function as this middleman, and they are propped up as an exemplar for minority success, despite their historical exclusion from the higher forms of civic and political life. In other words, right, this model minority trope is oftentimes evoked to discipline other minority groups for their struggles, while distracting us away from the white dominant systems that created them in the first place. In framing Asian people as the standard bearer for minority success, it's implicitly blaming other people of color, specifically Black people, as the harbinger of their own failures. And you can kind of see even in this graph, right, how Asian Americans are sort of put into this middle ground of an inferior to superior, foreigner to insider. And by existing in that strange wedge category, right, it allows us not to comment on the systems that are keeping other communities of color down.
All right, so despite these harms, the model minority myth can be extremely seductive. So let's go over when Asians believe the model minority myth. So it can be seductive because when you're rewarded for aligning yourself with whiteness and distancing yourself from Blackness, you might want to continue it. You might believe it. You're like, yes, I am the superior minority. This can look like staying silent in the face of injustice, changing your names, losing your language, stereotyping other POC, using racial slurs, disrespecting other POC, repeating to yourself and to other people that Asians are the privileged class. And what I've been seeing a lot recently actually is the inability to center your own community, as in like, oh, Asians should be looked over, or Asians don't experience any hardship or less hardship, or et cetera, where you're not able to center yourself. And this is especially seductive when targeting a newly immigrant population who will face oppression and discrimination for not assimilating. And there's gonna be real, there's a lot of cultural values in that. Like, how many times have your parents told you to keep your head down and not say anything? So lots of culturally taught believing of the model minority. There can also be a sense of pride when uplifted by the dominant group in power and applauded for your work ethic and apparent success. And while these reasons might appear logical, the desire of some Asian people to distance themselves from Black people only perpetuates the divides between us and panders to whiteness. As we shared earlier in this session, the proximity to whiteness is conditional, and it is weaponized against the Black community. So those who buy into the model minority myth really need to take a step back and recognize that this stereotype holds up Asians in comparison to other people of color, and particularly perpetrates anti-Blackness, and ultimately that hurts all of us. It doesn't help any of us. The myth was created by a white person, and it's perpetuated by white dominant culture, and ultimately Asians must work to reject it in order to reclaim our own narratives, our own identities, By buying into the myth, Asians continue to seek approval and acceptance from white people. And Asians deserve to define who Asians are for themselves, not by what other people tell them.
Yes. So we debunked the myth, we unpacked some of its harms. Now I wanted to take a moment to look at some of more recent case studies of this myth in action, right? And when you really look at it, you see it all around our world, right? So let's take a look at a couple of contemporary examples. I hope the slide works because I innovated with some animations and translations, but let's take a look.
All right, well, we just went over what happens when Asians internalize the model minority myth. What happens when non-Asians believe in the model minority myth? It can look like anti-Asian racism spiking by 1900% during the COVID-19 pandemic through a surge of racist remarks, such as Kung flu virus or China virus. It can also look like YG rap lyrics that give instructions on how to target Asian people. This is a quote. First, you find a house and scope it out. Find a Chinese neighborhood because they don't believe in bank accounts. So you see that these lyrics reflect attitudes that result in the hate crimes that many in the Asian community are experiencing today. In fact, Asian elders are being murdered and being targeted every day in Chinatowns across the country currently. I just want to emphasize that upholding model minority myth can lead to something as serious as murder. So even though the model minority myth implies that Asians enjoy widespread prosperity and acceptance in society, it cannot protect Asian people against the physical and verbal attacks happening.
So the second example that I wanted to highlight was some of the dangers, right, of believing the myth, specifically how the myth is being used as a racial wedge tool that I discussed. And so this is an example of the affirmative action case that took place at Harvard University. And there were a lot of white activists who used Asians to take down affirmative action policies. So a bit of context, in 2014, an organization that was led by a white conservative activist, Edward Bloom, basically sued Harvard for allegedly discriminating against Asian American applicants. The Trump administration opened an investigation into Harvard as part of their effort to target race-conscious affirmative action. And that kind of move didn't really align with how a lot of Asian Americans felt, right? A lot of Asians, the majority of Asians actually support affirmative action policies. And despite that support, Asian Americans, especially in these convenient cases, are co-opted as mascots to dismantle policies that help other help other racial minorities. And so this is a great example of how some of the harms that can happen when white people and also when some Asian people believe in the myth. And then lastly, I just wanted to kind of end more on a optimistic note. I think the truth when it comes to the model minority myth and the tensions that exist among different communities of color is that there is a lot of solidarity amongst Asians and other people of color. Asians in the US owe a lot of their progress to the civil rights movement led by and in solidarity with other people of color. And for decades, activists of color from both Asian and Black communities have stood alongside each other in critical moments, all the way back from the Vincent Chin murder protests in the 1980s to the Black Lives Matter movement to today. And that's not to say that there isn't more to be done. Of course, there is always much more to be done on solidarity, but some of these more recent examples remind us that contrary to the myth, our liberation, right, is bound together. So we spent this whole session debunking the myth and explaining why it's harmful. I hope that you all see that even though believing the myth might not seem overtly harmful or maybe even capital R racist, after all, you know, being told that you're smart for being Asian doesn't feel super racist, even though it's problematic, and we kind of see and understand why. But I hope that you all understand that it's an ideology that is oftentimes propped up by those who stand to benefit from racial division. And like the invisible smog, right, that we breathe, it filters into our lives. We acquiesce it without even noticing, and it shows up in so many different places, from the policy decisions that happen in our political institutions to the dinner conversations that you might even have with your Asian auntie.
So with that said, what does it mean to reject the myth? So we thought of some calls to action to give to you on what are we going to do to reject this completely and get rid of it.
So the first example that we thought of was it's important that we educate, that we historicize, that we contextualize. I think the first step in combating any kind of myth is just educating ourselves. Notice when it rears its ugly head and make sure that you have the language, that you have the context to push it back, right? And if you're here, you're already on that right path. Ask yourself, is the language or the mindset that's being used to talk about Asian people inclusive, right? Is it commenting on injustice, or is it narrowly applying the concept of injustice to a select group of Asian people, right? That might make it model minority myth adjacent mindset. Ask yourself, who stands to benefit, for instance, when you hear model minority myth idea from that trope, right? Is it being indifferent to the plight of other racial groups, for instance?
Yep. The second would be reimagine Asian. So reject the stereotype by proving Asians are more than their model minority tropes. Combat the homogenization of Asians by celebrating diverse narratives, not just East Asian, and using pan-ethnic terms. So using media or visibility representation in your personal circles or workplaces or your school curriculums, it works to combat this Asian stereotype that is fed to us all the time. We, as Asian people, can create our own narratives, our own visuals, our own representation, and challenge those in our workplaces and schools to do the same.
And the last one, especially for those of us who identify as Asian in this space, we got to pledge. Whoops, this keeps happening. Sorry about that. We got to pledge not to wedge, right? So notice when you are being used as another racial political wedge, or when you see another Asian person or an Asian group being used as a racial political wedge, right? Or this middleman that is supporting white supremacy or perpetuating anti-blackness. Always make sure that you are standing in solidarity with other racial groups.
And finally, even after we say all of that, I always get questions like, what does that actually mean? What do I have to say? Well, when I ask my friends to ally themselves with me as an Asian person, I give them this template. So this is the template of what I want to see Asian allies say. I do not condone violence against Asian from my community or any community. It is wrong. I will not accept any excuse for that violence around me and in my spaces, physical or online. If I see it, I will interrupt it however I can. We have the power to stop the harm our community is causing, and we have some unpacking to do of the anti-Asian mindset that sits in our community that can and has resulted in the loss of life. And I also want to say that that applies in reverse for the Asian community and how we can also ingest anti-Asian mindsets for ourselves, and also how we can also do these things for other communities. So it goes both ways. So now that we have this template, why don't you go ahead and drop in the chat some of your ideas on how we can get rid of model minority, anything that you can do in real life. I speak frequently on my Instagram about meme activism. I hate meme activism because no matter how many times on social media reposting a meme, that's not causing real change. What's causing real change is the communities that you're building around you and the emails that you're sending and the conversations you're having. So like, what is something that you can do in your life today and with the people around you to dispel model minority and challenge them to do better?
So let us know in the comments. Why don't we take about 2 minutes to brainstorm a couple of things that we can say on our own to counter the myth every time it comes out. And hopefully we can use that, keep that in our mind, keep that in our pocket, so to speak, so that we can dish it out every single time we come across a problematic statement that is very model minority myth-esque.
Yeah. So I think Jordana, to counter the model minority myth, decided to put this whole thing on, called us, and was like, hey, can you come? That is one awesome action. If she didn't do that, we wouldn't be here. Y'all wouldn't be here today, learning the vocabulary that we've just given you. So that's one thing that she demonstrated doing. So go ahead and drop in what you could do. And also TK, what's something that you've done recently to counter model minority besides this presentation?
Yeah. I mean, Kiana, I'm going to be honest with you. Until I met you and we worked on this together, the idea of data being so aggregated and how problematic that is in sending forth this monolithic understanding of API people was something I haven't thought of. I also think of just generally the importance of collaborating and working with other Asian people. We don't have that many experiences and opportunities to connect and hear each other's story. And like in the slides that you showed, we're so disparate, right? And I oftentimes find myself being the only Asian person in a certain space. And so seeking out other Asian people, working with them, and being unapologetic, I think is something that can really help combat that myth. What about you, Kiana?
I love that. So recently I sent 10 emails to Black friends of mine asking them to um, dispel the attacks that are happening. And I asked them to do it publicly, and they did. They wrote their work. You know, one of my friends is an NBA player. He sent it to his NBA group chat, and then all these NBA players started posting it on their Instagrams and talking with their companies, their sponsors, Nike, ESPN, on like, why aren't there Asian sports people, you know, all those things. So I sent those 10 emails asking them to like directly do something in their industry, in their circles. I also work to, on a smaller scale, whenever my grandma, my mom, and I go get Korean barbecue, I always invite somebody outside of culture to come with us. That way they get introduced to one, Asian people in like a more close-knit setting, because if we don't invite, then they're not going to have that experience. And two, just to be able to share in culture, to share a part of myself, something that's important to me. And that way they also feel like they're, you know, in community, we're in community with each other. So small scale what I do, big scale what I do.
I love that. I think asking other folks, especially other communities of color, to show up for us does make a big difference. And it goes to show when it comes to this kind of work, right? Promoting social justice, trying to create an equitable society, we all operate in different lanes. And the folks who are here, right, whether you're a student, whether you're a professor, whether you're an educator, we all have our own lanes. And so I'm loving some of the things that I'm seeing in the chat. Catherine saying, I want to make sure they have conversations with other folks when they think that Asian people are white adjacent. Yusuf also saying, yeah, I want to make sure that I'm educating other folks about how it's not true. And the more we arm ourselves with information, the more we arm ourselves with facts and knowledge, and the more we can engage in these conversations, I think we can create a better society for everyone.
We have another one. I think calling people out when they repeat stereotypes or make jokes at the expense of certain races. Sometimes it's uncomfortable when you could just laugh it off, but if you do, then it's like you're agreeing with them and they might not see what they're doing wrong. I know sometimes I've done this and the other person didn't even see how what they were saying was offensive. I think interrupting racist tropes is really, really important. And it goes back to the template. And I use it all the time. Whenever my mom says something racist, I'm like, oh no, honey, you can't say that around me. No, we're not, I will not tolerate it in front. Like you can't say that in front of me and you shouldn't be saying that at all. Yeah. So I think interrupting racist tropes is really, really important regardless across all races, because then they start to think like, oh, I can't be around this person if I'm going to continue perpetrating these stereotypes.
Yeah. I also feel like, you know, I grew up in a white suburb. And so sometimes the own coping strategies and mechanisms that I had when I encountered racist jokes or microaggressions against Asian people was to kind of join it. Yeah, I am a bad driver, right? And that kind of goes back to this sort of assimilationist mindset where I'm pandering, right, to a certain crowd. And so I hear you, Silky, and some of the discomfort that one might feel, or we might just tell ourselves or convince ourselves that somehow it's not a big issue. But it's important, just like how Kiana was saying, to intervene and to educate, right, when we have that moment. So I'm noticing a couple of questions come in. And so why don't we just move on to the Q&A portion? And if you folks have any questions, you can either drop a question just like Hassan did, or you can just unmute yourself or raise your hand and let us know. But the question says, how pervasive would you say API folks collectively internalize the modern minority myth? And how does this lead to the challenges with personal mental health, arguments with elders, and even anti-blackness? That is a lot to unpack. So Kiana, I'm just gonna throw it over to you.
I wish I could pull up statistics to you right now, but I think that you could probably see that in the suicide rates. When you look at suicide rates of Asian Americans, and it's not good. And it is very, very pervasive in our, actually in this, 14 years and 14 to 18, and then, young adult age group. When you see those rates, it's so obvious that these people are one, internalizing model minority myth, internalizing a lot of shame, a lot of blame, a lot of bullying, because other people have internalized model minority myth and then they start to believe it themselves. And you can see that in the most extreme case of suicide, but also as how many Asian Americans are actually going to therapy. I'm part of like an Asian collective that goes to Asian therapists, but how frequently is that happening? How many of your parents are going to therapy? My mom definitely is, and I've tried a million times. But, so our elders have, experienced wartime trauma. They've experienced assimilation, losing their languages, all these things, but they're not taking care of their mental health. And that comes out in a lot of ways. The thing is, like, then it passes on, then they have all these things going on with them and it passes on to us. So what are we doing about it? It affects us times two. So we're taking on the world, then we take on our elders. And so how do we take care of ourselves? So, I mean, like I said, I wish I could pull out stats. I just didn't have them prepared, but I know that the suicide rate is very, very high in this like age group. And
I was,
regarding, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I was kind of struck by the first part of the question about how much have we internalized this model minority myth? And I want us to kind of be vulnerable, and I'll be vulnerable in a bit, but drop a +1 if you have ever internalized at any point in your life, right? Aspects or dimensions, elements of the model minority myth, right? Especially if you are an AAPI person. And just from my own experience in high school and some of the difficulties that I had as an Asian person, a gay person of color, I think there are many negative and positive stereotypes that I've internalized being Asian, right? And trying to navigate those challenges, especially when you are oftentimes the only Asian person in a room, is difficult. And I think, Hassan, your question really intercuts with a lot of other topics around how do we have these conversations around different generational lines, right? How I internalize race is so different from how my parents internalize race, who were immigrants from Japan. How do we talk about this in the context of mental health, where oftentimes in Asian communities, there's a big stigma around discussing and unpacking these. And so I love that question. I don't know if I necessarily have an answer, but I appreciate you for bringing it forward.
Yeah. Um, so are people supposed to drop in the chat how they personally internalize model minority myth? Yeah. I was born and raised in Hawaii, the island of Hawaii, and most people are Asian or indigenous on that island. And so I grew up in a predominantly Asian community. And so model minority was not a thing in my community for a really, really long time until I moved to Texas and people kept asking if I was Mexican. And I was like, what am I? When I had to have that discussion with my mom. And I feel like model minority was not a huge part of my life, but it has a huge effect on my life. So I literally achieved 4 degrees and I hit a ceiling where like people don't want to hire me or don't respect me or think that, I'm too young to be a professor or too girly to be a professor or things like that, where I'm like, I strived so hard for education because I internalized model minority myth when I thought like, okay, if I get more education, I will be, better. But in reality, I work in academia sometimes, but really my full time is Instagram. And my real passion was always art and media. And so now I get to do that full time. So if I would have not internalized model minority myth, I could have, pursued my passions much earlier instead of going to higher education for 12 years, although I'm not complaining.
So I'm noticing in the chat, Kimberly said, I feel like I need to understand the myth better so that I can speak to it better. Totally agree. And as a parent, right, she saw a lot of Chinese and Indian parents being very pro-education for their kids. So the question here is, would you explain that by saying that they moved to the US recently and are showing their cultural importance of education in the areas that they moved from? I think I'm understanding the question, but I just don't want to misunderstand. Kimberly, if you want to, feel free to unmute yourself. And I wanted this to be a dialogue as well and clarify a little. And then I also want to acknowledge that you asked the question about any other books or resources that you might want to recommend. So that is also something I'll open up to the group. If there are any resources that you all have around the model minority myth or some ideas, feel free to drop that in the chat.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I was in an area when my children were in elementary school, and just for an example, like the math club was made up of entirely Indian and Chinese kids, and so we, you know, the moms and the dads who weren't Asian felt like, oh, we're slacker. So we were really seeing that they were setting a good example for us with education. And I just want to be able to, it feels like there's a little bit of like truth behind the myth, but it feels like maybe I'm understanding that, we would say, well, these people came more recently and their cultures are, have a high value on education. Does that make sense? I'm just trying to figure out kind of like it feels like there's a little bit of truth behind the myth, and where's the truth versus the myth?
Right. Kimberly, if I'm understanding you correctly, like there are some cultures, right? And specifically groups within cultures that value education, right? That are pro-education, right? I think a lot of migrants who came to the States for search of a better job, the professional class, right, who came to the States in the 80s, the 90s, right? They might come from a cultural or generational context where in which education was a big cultural value. I think the problem with the myth is that it uses what a subset of group thinks, right, as the sort of dominant narrative for all of the other Asian groups. The reality of the Asian category is that it is so heterogeneous, it is so diverse, and there's so many different experiences. And even within the different ethnic and racial groups, there are different generational mindsets, geographic mindsets, religious mindsets. And so when we have this idea culturally that Asians are smart or Asians care about education, just because it is ascribed to a small set of the population, even if it's a relatively vocal or visible set, there is a danger, right, in leaning in on that idea because of the perpetuation of those stereotypes in the ways that it doesn't necessarily reflect the reality for other folks.
Yeah, thank you. So would you say?
Oh, sorry. I was just going to quickly chime in to your response. First, I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Amanda. I'm the Black Student Union Coordinator, and Jordana and I are collaborating on this event for Black History Month. And just to respond to that initial comment, like when I guess it really strikes me that this is being brought up, like when you say like, how your children were in elementary school and then there was like a math club. It was dominated by, Indian and Chinese kids, and how there's truth to the myth because it must assume that, or I guess at least maybe in your experience, that these cultures value education. And when I feel like the danger of that is, while that may be true, when you leave it that open-ended, that's kind of silently assuming that Black cultures and, just these other groups, Latinx cultures, these other minority groups don't value education. And that's something that, being a Black person through the educational system, I've got a lot, especially like when I was younger, like I struggled in math. And a lot of times I was embarrassed, like by my teachers in very public settings, because I was a Black student who struggled. So no, I'm not going to go to math club and face that shaming again, in a more intimate setting or in a different way. But that doesn't mean I don't value education. That doesn't mean that, my parents or my grandparents, perfect. I mean, both of them really instilled education in me. I mean, like my grandpa has a Ph.D., was one of the first Black people to get admitted into Washington State University, was head of his department. It was always the narrative to me that I had to get some sort of a post-secondary education. My household didn't necessarily care where it was. It wasn't, you need to be a doctor, you need to be a lawyer, you need to go to Harvard, but it was just, you need to better yourself as a Black person in America because people expect you to not care. So to hear that is really just like upsetting, because also there's just like multitudes of different levels that we have to acknowledge. Like, for example, my little sister, who's 2 years younger than me, has like special, I don't want to say she has a learning disability, it's not that bad, but she was able to get like some sort of like medical proof that some of her setbacks in her education weren't things that she could control. And when she would showcase this documentation to, her teachers and such, they always doubted her, and that it wasn't true, and that it was just another excuse for her to fall back behind, and that she didn't really have these issues that were diagnosed by several doctors. And it got to the point to where she transferred out of our school district because she was so badly mistreated. And there in the school district that we were in, which was Bothell, she was getting like D's. And then when she transferred to a new school district, she was a straight A student because she had just a different group of people that actually, motivated her to do better and weren't constantly shaming her. And these narratives are things that a lot of Black people and Black students, and those when I talk to the friends that I had personally growing up as Black, like in elementary, junior high, and high school, will say the same thing. And also just people that are members in the Black Student Union base a lot of these, educational shamings where, we'll go through things and we'll get rebuttlement from administration, professors and such, that we're making excuses and that we don't value our education. So I think while your intent with that may have not been the direction that I'm carrying it into, I would just almost suggest that you're careful with how you end those narratives, because as it's been stated before, it continues to amplify the narrative that, again, all Chinese and Indian kids are in the math club because they value education. Other cultures don't. And that's simply just not true.
If I may, I believe that I come also from a developing country where the only way to raise yourself socially is through education. So parents incentivize us to become lawyers, doctors, and engineers. And I went to law school and I hated every minute of it. I absolutely hate it. And even like when I was working, I like the politics part of it. I worked with electoral law for many years, and I didn't like the law part of it. I like the politics and interacting with people and talking with people. And I was pressured into do something and in that same way. So I think it's a mentality of developing countries, as you were saying, like China and India, because they're both with Brazil, like a developing country, where people are incentivized to as middle class or like upper class, like that's the only way for social prosperity and to assure that you'll have like the ways to maintain yourself. So I think that's like what reflects into that mentality of incentivizing people to study. So like my parents, they always incentivize us to go to study a lot, and they sacrifice themselves so that we could go to private schools, because that's the mentality. Like it's how you're going to achieve something. And it's the same, like we would get spanked if we didn't study. And I see a lot like of those myths that also reflect into many Latin cultures with the tiger moms. Like I have a tiger mom and I'm not Asian, so sometimes you pass on these and you stigmatize some groups. Well, it's not true for them many times. And sometimes it's like it happened in other cultures, but it doesn't, it's not perceived that way. So I think that's part of the mentality behind it. It's not that like they're more intelligent or anything. They incentivize us to study because it's the way to have social prosperity. And for example, in my country, if you have like any degree, like if you have a graduation degree, like if you have like in higher education, then even if you're arrested, you get like special cells. So education is what distincts you from the others and from the rest of the population. So that's how they do it. And that's like why they incentivize a lot of people to study also, because it's a way to distinct yourself from the rest. So I think that to me, like, that's why it happens in a lot of those, and like the countries we're talking about, like India and China. To me, it's the same mentality, you know.
Yeah, I'd like to also make the analogy that when you make assumptions, or you look at your own group of your own circle, and you make assumptions based off of that, that is not the majority. So let's say I'm like, oh, you know, my dad is white and I went to his country club, and so all white people are one, rich, and two, racist. Well, okay, that might be in that group, but really, if you look at it statistically, white people make up the majority of impoverished people in America. Also, if we look at racism, you know, 60% of white people supported the Black Lives Matter movement. Statistically, does it make sense? Is it true? There are definitely racist white people. There are definitely rich white people, but does it make it true for the overall? So of course, are there Chinese and Indians who do like math, who do want to seek higher education? Of course, that's true, but it's not true for the majority. So I just wanted to make the analogy between like these tropes that continue in these spaces that don't exist for the whole. And that's what we're trying to combat, is that when you make these overarching generalization, it doesn't call for solidarity for anybody. And I wanted to thank you for asking that question, and thank you, Amanda, for expressing your feelings.
Thank you so much. And I think these are the conversations that really need to take place. And I think, Amanda, you really hit the nail on the head in that. I think what's oftentimes ignored, right, is the sort of historical structural factors that make it easier for certain groups to prioritize education and make it more difficult, right, for other groups not necessarily do so. And it's not necessarily the race in and of itself that has this magical quality of being oriented more towards education. It's really the systems that we occupy that have sorted folks along racial and class lines, right, in a way that perpetuates these negativities. So I got a question about, can you give a definition about racism, right? Or what is your definition of racism? I think of racism as occupying multiple levels, right? Typically, folks think racism is sort of this interpersonal thing, right? Someone called me a slur, that's racist. And I think interpersonal incidents certainly fall under the category of racism, but I ascribe to racism as being attached to broader systems, right? The organizations, the institutions that we occupy, the ideology, right? That we are oftentimes unaware that we are being influenced by, the cultural expectations, the connotations that we all have to navigate as a result of race. I also think about race as intrinsically tied to the concept of power, right? And so when folks say, folks of color can be racist, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, at least for me, right? Because racism, right, as a system, is something that combines those beliefs and expectations to the power that a majority group has. I don't know if I made myself clear at all, but anyone else have a different definition? Or Kiona, what is your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I agree. Racism is a system. And oftentimes when you hear, people of color can't be racist towards each other, that is true if we're talking about racism as a system. So people of color can't oppress each other because we're not at the top of a system. That's what white supremacy is, as a system based on race, as a racial hierarchy. But it doesn't mean that we can't be prejudiced, bigoted, discriminatory towards each other. So if we're talking about racism as a system, and that who is at the top, who controls everything right now as the world order is, white supremacy controls everything. It doesn't mean white people as individuals control everything. It means that the system is based on white people to succeed.
And I think it's a great definition because it shows the ways that we can be complicit in it, right? And if we're also not active, intentional, conscientious about pushing out against it, we can sometimes condone, right, or facilitate that system to continuously exist. Hassan asked a question: how would you apply your definition to the events of violence against Asian elders in California and the young adult elders? Ooh, that's a big question to unpack. Kiona, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. So when the perpetrator is a person of color, it can be viewed as prejudiced, bigoted, discriminatory. However, if it's upholding a system of white supremacy, which is what the model minority myth is to uphold a system of white supremacy, then then this is an act of racism, and that it's acting as a tool to uphold the system that we're all oppressed under. So for me, when it's a POC against POC crime, it's almost never counted as hate crime because they're saying that we can't oppress each other, which is true on a systemic level. But if we're playing into that system that causes us to oppress each other, then we are being racist. We are acting on that power structure of white supremacy.
I think of like criminality are oftentimes reflections of the situation, right, that folks find themselves in, and sort of the legacy of a culture or a group or a community that has been systematically harassed and criminalized, incarcerated, and sort of the generations of trauma that exist, right, that makes crime a form of survival or a way in which the way that their treatment manifests. I feel like we can use the racial wedge gap as a form of this analysis, right? People at the top, those in power, are very much okay and comfortable with the minority groups quarreling amongst themselves. So as long as if there's division and a lack of solidarity amongst the Latinos, the Latinx folks, the Asians, the indigenous folks, the Black people, we're not really going to critique the system, right? The system of white supremacy, the system of those with power and wealth. And so, when I see these attacks that are happening within racial groups, I look at it through that lens.
Yeah, and just to point out that the media does take a part in this. Asian American attacks weren't anywhere, and I felt so alone for the longest time. My family's been attacked, I've been attacked, but this has happened throughout my whole life, not just COVID-19. But when you don't see that anywhere in the media, you don't feel seen, you feel alone, I felt angry, actually, the entire pandemic. I'm like, how is this happening so frequently and no one is saying anything? But then as soon as somebody of a POC starts to, or I guess I should say particularly Black, start to attack Asian people, target Asian neighborhoods, it's all over the media. So we also have to be careful about how the media is playing this, how it's spinning to us, and how we react to it, because it is happening, but it's not only from this one group. It's happening across all groups, and anti-Asian sentiments are embedded in every single aspect of our society, in every institution, in everything. All the propaganda that you ingest is anti-Chinese at the moment, and that has real effects on Asian people today. So whether or not you feel anti-Asian sentiments, you are ingesting it on a constant basis. So it is a systemic thing that is happening in America today and for the past 200, 300 years. So it's not just one group. So I just want to take a step back and make sure that the media isn't playing you, because they play all of us all the time.
Not just the media, politicians too, right? When Trump says it's the Kung Flu virus, it's the China virus, and puts the emphasis of the pandemic disproportionately on China and Asian people, he's really doing it to muddy the discourse and not have people focus on his administration's pandemic response, right? Regardless of where the origin is, there was an administration, people in power, those in governance who failed when it comes to preventing, mitigating, and also addressing the effects of the pandemic. And that's an inconvenient truth for people in power to acknowledge. And so let's just blame China, right? Let's make it about Asians. And we see that kind of anti-Asian sentiment perpetuate in these lower income communities, right? And communities of color in the attacks against elderly folks.
Yeah, so that's one thing that I was getting so pissed watching the news, watching the president go on and saying in a joke, kind of making fun of it, the situation, and with the China virus and the Kung flu and many other people in his administration, talking, like using those terms and vocabulary, and some media outlets doing that. And it was like, it was getting me, like taking my breath away, because I was getting so mad at it. And following that, we did have a few attacks. I think there were 2 attacks in the International District here in Seattle, when the ex-president was using that type of language and saying those things. And it's just so frustrating, because you didn't, like, so you didn't have like the coverage, and people like telling them why it's inappropriate and why you shouldn't do that, and like, and replicating that and trying to educate people even through the news. Like, when you have like the highest leadership in the country directly attacking a whole group, because when you say China virus, you're attacking the whole East Asian community, because a lot of people can't make that distinction, and even like, you shouldn't even have to make that distinction. You shouldn't be talking about people like that, and like putting it on the people, and like trying to like TK said, distract people away from your mismanagement of the situation. You know, it was something that, like, I was revolted watching the news for 3 or 4 months. Like, sometimes I would just even turn it off. I just couldn't take it. It was awful.
We stand Jordana, true ally over here. Well, I wanted to wrap it up, but first, before we wrap it up, I just want to say thank you, first and foremost, to the Black Student Union for, including us as a part of your Black History Month. When this very well could have, gone on and not been acknowledged at all. And I hope that it was helpful to you. I hope that we were able to understand it more. And if it didn't, we did do an elaborated, elongated version for the Smithsonian on the website that I have dropped in the chat. And I also wanted to thank Andrea, who organized the entire Smithsonian chat and lesson, who also is here. But I'll go ahead and drop the link again, but please go ahead and look at that. And also, since it's Black History Month, you should also check out Asian and Black solidarity movements, which has also been erased from your history, because that is nowhere. And there is a reason for that, because we were been strong, gonna keep on going strong in solidarity with each other. So please go ahead and check out those 2 sessions. And also TK has another session on being queer and Asian American, which you almost never, you don't see Asians, and you definitely aren't seeing queer Asians. So you should go ahead and check that out also.
Thanks for that plug. And speaking of plugs, we would love to continue on this conversation with all of you. I really do believe that when it comes to these kind of discussions, they only happen in spaces like this. And so feel free to reach out to us. You see our, Twitter bios and social media handles in our little names. Jordana, I'm sure you can follow up with our contact information as well. But we're in this together, and I'm a firm believer that our oppression, our liberation is inextricably bound. There's a fly that keeps coming into my face, so I apologize about that. But I'm honored and humbled to be here, and thank you so much for having this conversation with us.